we have the Honorable William Delker. He is an Associate Justice in the New Hampshire Superior Court, currently at the Hillsborough Superior Court North in Manchester. He's active in at least half a dozen supervisory and rules committees on the court. You can read his whole bio on our website. Apropos for tonight, he has been actively involved in civics education with area schools and teaches remedies and state constitutional law as an adjunct professor at UNH Franklin Pierce Law School. He has his JD from American University's Washington College of Law, and he got his undergraduate from University of Massachusetts Amherst. There's always one.
There's always.
Yes.
There's plenty of us.
So tonight, hold on to your hats. He's going to talk about first in the nation from the beginning, the original New Hampshire Constitution of 1776. So please welcome Judge Delker.
Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. This is actually a fun day for me because I am bookending my civics education. I started this morning with Litchfield Middle School 6th graders, not talking about the New Hampshire Constitution so much as generally what we do as judges, and I'm ending with this esteemed crowd tonight. So, you know, in this year of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, you know, we hear so much about the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. I mean, I think probably virtually everyone in this room, if I said you were exercising your First Amendment rights or your Second Amendment rights, or you're going to take the Fifth, you would have an idea about what I was talking about, because so much attention is focused on the United States Constitution. But many, many people do not realize that their states have their own constitutions, which provide many of the same, but often many more protective rights than the U.S. Constitution, and often cover subjects that are not covered at all by the United States Constitution. And New Hampshire is no exception. In fact, as I'm going to talk about tonight, New Hampshire was the very first of the 13 then colonies which wrote a constitution. That lasted during the 8 years of the Revolution. And then in 1784, we adopted our permanent constitution, which is the constitution we still use today, and which is the second oldest written constitution in the world, still in functioning, for functioning government. And I actually have, and I want to, before I forget about this, at the end of the lecture, I have copies, the Secretary of State prints copies of the Constitution. This is the 1784 Constitution, not the one I'm going to spend most of my time talking about tonight, but I encourage you to take a copy and take it home and read it, because it is a fascinating document. It is very readable. There is a surprising amount of rights and theory about how and why, where power comes from, the responsibility of magistrates, public officials like myself, to be responsible to the people, to be accountable to the people. And so I really encourage you to read it. It is a very interesting document that not a lot of people crack open, so I brought copies for you, and I hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to talk tonight mostly about the 1776 Constitution, and it's quite a different document than the one that I have up here. And by design, it was intended to be a temporary constitution, to hold us over during the wartime until either, as I'll talk about in more detail, either peace was restored or some formal break occurred and we needed a permanent constitution. So given the crowd I've got here tonight, I suspect many of you know the history of New Hampshire and New Hampshire's role in the American Revolution far better than I do. So I'm not here to give you a detailed lecture about the New Hampshire role in the American Revolution, but I do think it's helpful to put some post landmarks along the way, and I'm going to talk about some of the major events leading up to the drafting of the 1776 Constitution. So forgive me because I am not a historian, but I do think it is important to cover some of these things. And the other thing I want to emphasize is, this is not just about a single event that happened in 1776. This is about we are part of a living history. And the 1776 Constitution was, for us and for the country, the first step of formal self-government after the break, before even the official break with the Crown on July 4th, 1776. And it was we were the very first state to adopt a constitution, to govern ourselves during this period of time. And I think that's something to remember and to remind ourselves that we are part of that ongoing history. We continue to be responsible for the government that that operates in this state, and that's important to keep in mind. And as the saying goes, liberty requires our eternal vigilance. And I hope today this story that I convey to you hammers home that point. So in preparing these remarks, I thought a lot about why New Hampshire's role in the American Revolution and in the quest for independence is largely overlooked or forgotten. And quite disappointingly, I was just down in Philadelphia last week, I think it was the week before, and I went to the Museum of the American Revolution, which is a new museum, and I went to the National Constitution Center, and New Hampshire's role and this Constitution is nowhere to be found anywhere. Massachusetts gets all the credit for being first, and they're not. They aren't. It isn't true. I mean, and so I thought a lot about, why is that? Do they get all the credit? I mean, they have a lot of people who wrote a lot of the histories, but we, New Hampshire, I think in our early history, we didn't have any rabble-rousers like Samuel Adams. We didn't have any of the vaunted intellectuals like Abigail or Samuel Adams who wrote letters back and forth to each other about theories of government. We didn't have a tragic figure like Alexander Hamilton that you can write a Broadway musical about. New Hampshire, the revolutionaries were merchants, they were farmers, they were doctors, they were lawyers, and they were just trying to hold on to their liberties in the face of that threat by royal authority. And most of the people we know about from New Hampshire from that period of time, the household names to the extent you can call them that, John Langdon, Josiah Bartlett, John Sullivan, Matthew Thornton, William Whipple, they're all known to most people who know anything about New Hampshire revolutionary history because of their position on the national stage, and less so about what they did for us here in this state and the founding of this state's government. But all of them, every single one of them, played a pivotal role in the foundation of New Hampshire's 1776 and 1784 constitutions. And perhaps the most important person of all, we don't even know what he looked like. Meshach Ware, and I'm going to talk more about him as the evening goes on, but he never took the national stage. His whole career was here in New Hampshire, and he held every single major position during the American Revolution, often, or I think all at the same time. He was chief judge of the court. He was president of the council, which was our version, or that version of the Senate. He was president of the Committee of Safety, which was essentially the executive body during that period of time. And like I said, we don't even have a portrait of the man. And he served in those roles for the entire 8 years, and he also had many important roles before the American Revolution. He was one of the judges in the Pine Tree riots. So, his career goes back quite a ways in this state. And so I asked former New Hampshire archivist Brian Burford, who's a specialist in Mishak ware, to share some of his insights. Like, who was this guy? Why do we know so little about him? And so this is what Brian wrote to me. He said, "My recent studies on this topic suggest to me that, as Jeremy Belknap said of Mishak, he didn't have an inventive genius, but he was a man of sound judgment, moderate temperament, and with a solid foundation of knowledge, perhaps due to his long experience functioning in government offices." So that's a quote from the historian Jeremy Belknap. And Brian went on to say, "I might also add, Mishak was a practical man who could be relied on to accomplish needed tasks. He was very good at listening to people's ideas and collecting them into something coherent." And so, that doesn't make for a great story or, as I said before, a Broadway play, but it makes for good government. And that's what we got during that period of time. So I hope after tonight you'll have a better appreciation for the work that these founders did. All right, so now a little bit about the sort of foundations or beginnings. Most of you know this. New Hampshire founded or settled, I should say, in 1623, and thereafter governance vacillated in New Hampshire between being an independent colony and being partially controlled or governed by Massachusetts or in conjunction with the governor of Massachusetts. And that happened, and that went on until 1741, when Benning Wentworth was appointed the first full-time royal governor sort of until the Revolution. He was the second to last before the Revolution. And Benning was, of course, a Portsmouth native. He was influential merchant and appointed by George II in 1741. He retired and he was able to maintain control, I should say, here in New Hampshire, and did a pretty good job of maintaining pretty firm control over the government in New Hampshire. And he did that through a combination of factors. He gave away a lot of land, and he gave away a lot of appointments to friends and family. And that does a good job sort of making people happy and making sure you have people that are favorable to you in positions of power. When he retired in around 1767, his nephew, John Wentworth, who was born in Portsmouth, but at the time had been in London managing family affairs, he was appointed to replace his uncle, and he came back to Portsmouth to become the last royal governor for the state. Oh, hopefully. I think I have technical errors here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So now let's fast forward a little bit and talk about the beginning of the end. So between May and December of 1774, I'm actually going to back up a little bit because tensions began really to increase in New Hampshire with the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. I mean, there were events and things brewing even before that, but the Tea Act sort of hypercharged the tension with royal authorities. And then the Boston Tea Party, as I'm sure many of you know, took place in December of 1773. And in response to that, Parliament passed the Boston Port Act in March of 1774. And the result of the Boston Port Act was that there would be no trade in and out of Boston Harbor until reparations were paid for the tea that was dumped into the harbor. And that, of course, that was a punitive measure that really hypercharged the revolution. And the colonies, especially colonies like New Hampshire with a port like Portsmouth, felt that if they can do that to Boston, why couldn't they do that to us? And so there was a real move at that time to begin to coordinate efforts among the colonies. And in May of 1774, the General Assembly voted to create a committee of correspondence. And so I'm going to stop here a minute because we're going to talk about a couple of different legislative bodies, and they're confusing because they have similar names. So I'm going to call what was it was called the General Assembly, but it was the elected body that operated under the royal government. I'm going to call that the Royal Legislature for ease of reference to think about it, but it was called officially the General Assembly. They voted to create a committee of correspondence to communicate with the other colonies about grievances and coordinate resistance efforts and to keep in touch with that. And especially over issues like the Boston Port Bill and other issues. And so on June 8th, 1774, Governor Wentworth dissolved the royal legislature that was sitting here in Portsmouth. And that was an important power that royal governors had and exercised across the colonies when they didn't like what the legislature was doing. They could disband the legislature, send them home, call a new election, or just disband it and not call a new election, and then they wouldn't have to deal with the rabble-rousers. And so Governor Wentworth dissolves the royal legislature, and the delegates who were sitting, I don't know exactly where the building was, but it was somewhere. Yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was right out the window here. It doesn't exist anymore. They went from there. Initially, they refused to leave. They didn't take the orders of the governor. And the governor actually had to bring in the sheriff and threaten to arrest them if they wouldn't leave. And so that didn't deter them. The delegates favorable to the revolutionary cause went to nearby Studley's Tavern, which is now down in the Strawberry Bank, thank you, but was, I think, over around the corner right here. And there they set up, they gathered and they voted to create the first provincial Congress that was to meet in Exeter on July 1st, 1774. And so they got together and they said, we're going to send out messages to the towns to elect delegates to send to this new provincial Congress, which is going to meet in Exeter. And the purpose of that first provincial Congress was to elect delegates to go to Philadelphia to meet in the Continental Congress, which was where all of the colonies were going to meet and coordinate their efforts. And so that happened. The first provincial Congress met on July 21st, 1774. They elected John Sullivan and Nathaniel Folsom to be the two New Hampshire representatives who went down to Philadelphia, and Folsom and Sullivan were there from September to October of 1774, attending the first Continental Congress. So things move forward, and we begin with the first official open rebellion. First official open rebellion, not just here in New Hampshire, but one of the first acts of open rebellion you can call maybe the Pine Tree Riots an early act of open rebellion, but this is a more formalized effort. And on December 13th, 1774, Paul Revere, of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, takes a ride to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because word is out that they are going to take the powder stores from Fort William and Mary and remove them because they're worried about what the colonists are doing. And Paul Revere comes to Portsmouth to warn the delegates that you got to do something about this. And so he meets, I think it was Samuel Cutts out here somewhere in the square, and they get together some of the leading officials, and on the next day, on December 14th, 1774, between 200 and 400 people gather together under the leadership of, I think it was Sullivan on that date, and they march over to the Fort William and Mary, and they besiege the fort. Now, there were only 5 or 6 royal royal soldiers there at the fort, so it wasn't heavily manned, and no shots were fired, but they didn't give in right away, and the the colonists, the rebels, the patriots, whatever you want to call them at that point, actually storm the fort. They take I think it was a sergeant or a captain in charge of the fort. They essentially take him into custody. They haul down the royal colors, the royal flag, and they remove about 100 barrels of gunpowder from the fort, and then they disperse that to various towns around the seacoast. And that gunpowder is ultimately used in the siege of Boston later in 1775. And then the next day, that doesn't end, because the next day, John Sullivan and John Langdon led another group, this time of between 1,200 and 1,500 people, back to the fort. And this time they seized the cannon and other small arms from the fort and secured those as well. And so things are not going so well for royal authority at this point. But Governor Wentworth does not give up quite so easy. In the background here, we still have this provincial congress. So there's a second provincial congress that meets in Exeter again on January 25th of 1775. And the purpose of the second Congress is for them to elect representatives to go back to Philadelphia for the second Continental Congress. And those, again, that was Sullivan and Langdon, who are elected to be our representatives in Philadelphia. So that happens on January 25th. On April 19th is the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, the beginning of official hostilities in the American Revolution. Not 3 days later, the New Hampshire convenes the third provincial Congress to decide how to respond to these hostilities in Massachusetts. And within days, there are at least 2,000 armed soldiers, Minutemen, who have marched to Boston to support the Massachusetts soldiers who are down there, because the British redcoats had retreated into Boston and now they've got Boston surrounded. And a lot of people, unless you see an old map of Boston, it's kind of hard to imagine this today, but there was just a spit of land, and most of Boston was surrounded by water and wetlands. And so they were able to sort of surround Boston and keep them in. So we had a lot of soldiers in the field and no functioning government at this point. So the third provincial Congress is set up to help create some order out of that chaos. And so between March and May of that 1775 year, Governor Wentworth starts to devise a plan to try to regain control of the situation. And he convenes the last royal legislature during that period. So he sends out messages to all the towns that are represented, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, to elect new delegates. And the legislature was in a part designed as a tool for to enforce royal authority, but sometimes, as we've seen here, they were bucking royal authority increasingly. And so what John Wentworth tried to do was to curate who was in the legislature, to try to pick people who were, at least he hoped, would be favorable to him. So at the time of this, in May of 1775, there were 36 delegates in the royal legislature who represented only 36 towns. But at the time, there were over 150 towns in New Hampshire. So only a very small percentage of the towns and the people were actually represented in the royal legislature. But of course, not all of them were sympathetic to the king. So what Wentworth tried to do in this last legislature is he picked 3 new towns where he had done land grants, one of them being in Plymouth, I think Landoff, or one of the other towns up in the Grafton County area. I forget the third town, Orford or some town up there. He said, I'm going to add those towns to the legislature, and those happen to be towns that I've settled with people who are favorable to me, and they're going to send delegates that hopefully will tip the balance of this legislature in my favor. Well, that didn't work so well for him, because between May and July, this new legislature meets, and they refuse to seat Governor Wentworth's the delegates he picked. So there was a tension between who got to pick who was going to be in the legislature. Wentworth said, I'm the governor, I get to pick who's represented. And the legislature says, no, we're the legislature, we get to decide who's going to be in the legislature. And they had this real standoff. And it came to a head with one particular representative. Oops, let me back up. It came to a head with one particular representative, John Fenton, who was a loyalist, a friend of John Wentworth's from Plymouth, New Hampshire. They refused to seat him, and so he stood up in the House and he berated them. And hang on, let me go forward here. Sorry, Mike. Come on. There we go. Oh, all right, so there we go. So he stood up in the House, berated them, and they essentially chased him out of the House, and he took refuge in Governor Wentworth's home, which is, I think, the Mark Wentworth house here in town. And so he's there on July 13th in Governor Wentworth's house, and the patriots besiege Governor Wentworth's house and order the governor to relinquish Fenton because of the way he berated them in the chamber. And when the governor initially refused, they rolled a cannon up to the front door and said, you're going to give him to us or else. And the governor was like, okay, he's all yours. And it didn't go so well for Fenton. He was arrested, imprisoned, sent to Exeter, I think ultimately banished, if I recall correctly, from the state as a loyalist. But the other part of that was that the next day, Governor Wentworth and his wife, who's here, Lady Frances Wentworth, they realized things are no longer safe. They had a young child. They said, we can't stay in the royal household anymore. So they retreated to Fort William and Mary in Newcastle. And they stayed there for much of the summer, ultimately realizing that things were not getting better. They were only getting worse. They boarded a ship, I think it was the Scarborough, sitting here in Portsmouth Harbor. They sat there for a while and eventually went to Massachusetts, and ultimately Governor Wentworth became the governor of Nova Scotia. So that was the collapse of royal government. With the end of the governor, there was no one left to run government in New Hampshire. So then the question is, well, what happens? What do we do now? We don't have a royal governor, so how do we proceed? So between May and November, the 4th Provincial Congress meets in Exeter. And this is an important step because the 3 prior provincial congresses had been elected for really specific and narrow purposes. The first 2 were just to elect delegates to go to the Philadelphia Convention. And the third one was to sort of gather some order around what was happening after the Lexington and Concord, but only met for very short periods of time. This 4th Provincial Congress was elected for a 6-month term and was designed to set up general government powers in the state in the absence of royal authority. And so I think this is a point where it's worth talking a little bit about the difference between the royal legislature that existed and this provincial Congress, because here we see a real shift in how power is exercised and by whom. So as I talked about a couple of minutes ago, the royal legislature had 36 representatives from 36 towns, mostly from the seacoast. Of the delegates in that of those 36 delegates, 2/3 of those delegates came from towns within 10 miles of Portsmouth. And the reason for that is because that was a stronghold of the governor. The governor's here, all the government royal officials are here, and so he's got a lot of people that are favorable to him in this area. Under the provincial Congress, this 4th Provincial Congress, only 1/4 of the representatives come from these same towns. The other 3/4 come from towns that had not previously been represented in the royal government and are outside of this. The other important thing is, I said there were about 150, 55 towns at that time. there were over 100 towns sent representatives to the 4th Provincial Congress. So you have a much more diverse, much bigger assembly than you did in the royal, the royal government. So this gets us to the beginning. Now I'm finally at the beginning of where we are with the Constitution. So on July 8th, 1775, the 4th Provincial Congress petitions the Continental Congress down in Philadelphia for permission to set up a civil government. Government had collapsed in New Hampshire, and the 4th Provincial Congress really had no authority. No one had vested them with authority to control the state. And so they wanted some direction from some higher power to say, what should we do? And how do we deal with this? So they petitioned, the 4th Provincial Congress petitioned the Philadelphia Congress for permission to set up a government. And so between July and October of that year, the New Hampshire delegates lobbied the other delegates from the other states and to allow New Hampshire to set up a royal government. Now, you may be like, well, why New Hampshire? I mean, Massachusetts, they had the same problems with their governor. Massachusetts was in a little bit different position because they had a royal charter that that gave them some structure for government. New Hampshire, it's a complicated story, but New Hampshire's royal charter didn't really have any meat or any structure to it whatsoever. There were very, very sparse documents from the royal government about what government here in this colony should look like. Massachusetts, on the other hand, had something more substantive than that. And so they were able to operate for a little while longer than New Hampshire. But in any event, the New Hampshire delegates ultimately succeeded, and on November 3rd, 1775, the Philadelphia Continental Congress granted New Hampshire permission to set up government. And I think it's worth reading because it's relatively short. That grant of permission says that Congress, taking into consideration the report of the Committee of the New Hampshire Instructions, resolved that it be recommended to the Provincial Convention of New Hampshire to call a full representation of the people, and that the representatives, if they think it necessary, establish such form of government as in their judgment will best produce the happiness of the people and most effectually secure peace and good order in the province during the continuance of the present dispute between Great Britain and the colonies. So our delegates did not waste any time. But before they do that, I think it's worth reading the letter that Josiah Bartlett and John Langdon sent back to the delegates, because their letter, sent back to New Hampshire, to the Provincial Congress, because their letter really gives a clue that this wasn't about just setting up a provisional government for the duration of the war. They recognized it as a first step to true independence. And for that reason, I think it's worth reading the actual letter itself. So on the same day as the resolution, they sent that, whoops, sorry about that. Well, we'll get to that in a second. All right, so let me just read it. It says, November 3rd, 1775, Sir, this serves to enclose a resolve of Congress relative to civil government for the colony of New Hampshire, by which you'll see recommended such form as shall be agreeable to the free representation of the people. In short, such a government as shall be most agreeable to the province. The argument on this matter, being the first of its kind, as we had no charter, were truly Ciceronial, and the eminent speakers did honor to themselves and the continent, carried a very great majority. The power is ample and full even to the choice of governor, if the colony should think it necessary, but that we humbly conceive worthy of consideration. You'll see that the government is limited to the present contest, to ease the minds of some few persons who are fearful of independence, we thought it advisable not to oppose that part too much. For once we have taken any sort of government, nothing but negotiation with Great Britain can set it aside. And that they recognized that once they took that step, this was a real sea change in our relationship with the royal crown. And so, so what happens? New Hampshire wastes absolutely no time getting started. November 13th, the letter gets here from Langdon and Sullivan, or Bartlett rather, I'm sorry. And on November 13th, the 4th Provincial Congress votes to establish a committee to frame and bring in a plan for future representation of the people of this colony. The very next day, they set up the recommendations for who can vote and participate. So they set up the voting rules. So every legal tax-paying inhabitant of New Hampshire is allowed to vote. And that's important because under colonial rule, you needed to have at least 50 pounds of taxable estate to vote. So the franchise already has been expanded. Next, any elected representative must have at least 200 pounds of real estate. And that seems unusual, but it also was an expansion of who could serve as representatives, because under royal authority, you needed 300 pounds of real estate to be elected to the legislature. Some of the other rules are kind of fun. No representative can be seated who bribes voters with liquor. And then each town, so this was an issue that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail in a few moments, but there was a big issue of debate was how many people are going to be in this legislature. And, and that's an issue we deal with to this day. And, and I'm going to talk about that some more. But they set up some rules, and the rules were, I'm not going to remember if I've got the number right. It's either 100 or 150 people per town. So if you had a town with either 100 or 150 tax-paying voters, they were called rateable polls, you could send one representative. And then if you didn't have between 100 or 150 people in your town, you could team up with another town, and the two towns could send a rep if you had that many people. And then they scaled it up. I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but if you had a certain number above that, you got a second representative, and a number above that, you got a third representative. And that didn't happen at all. As I said before, there were 36 towns with 36 reps, no matter what size the town was in the original Royal Assembly. And then the last resolve was that the 5th Provincial Congress would frame the government and then dissolve itself into a House of Representatives to sit for 1 year. And then on November 15th, 1775, the 4th Provincial Congress did in fact dissolve itself. It set out the call for voters to elect the 5th Provincial Congress, the 5th and final Provincial Congress before New Hampshire set up the government. And again, New Hampshire being not one to debate in a lot of detail and to get into a lot of theoretical discussions, set up the entire Constitution, our first Constitution, in just 15 days. So on December 21, the 5th Provincial Congress, so mind you, that's 3 weeks, or no, 5 weeks, 5 weeks since the last Congress. So that last Congress dissolved itself on November 15th. 5 weeks later, we've elected a new legislature, Congress. They are meeting in Exeter. They meet that day. They elect Matthew Thornton as president of the Congress. Between the 27th and 30th of December, the committee is put together to begin drafting the plan. And the members are Matthew Thornton, Meshach Ware, Ebenezer Thompson, Wiseman Claggett, Benjamin Giles, John Gidding, and Joseph Badger. And then on January 5th, 1776, they approve the first Congress, the first written Constitution in America. And we are the first. Some states claim to be the first, but the next state to set up a constitution was South Carolina in March of 1776, Virginia didn't get around to setting up their constitution until June of 1776. But the document itself, and I've got a little excerpt of it here, I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but there's not, frankly, a lot to say about it because it's a pretty bare bones document. It has no Bill of Rights. It has no separation of powers. It is entire document is 900 words, more than half of which is the preamble to the document. So only 450 words go into what the government actually looks like in this 1776 Constitution. And so it creates a basic outline. It's just a basic outline of government. And so, sorry about that. Come on. I don't know why it's not working here. Let me do it this way. Okay, that works. There we go. I'll go all the slides. Okay, so it has two houses of the legislature. It has a House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives elects a council, which acts as the Senate, but of 12 members. So it picks 12 people from the House of Representatives to be in the council, and those two bodies together act as the legislature, much like our House of Representatives and Senate does today. And all legislation has to pass both bodies, but there is no governor. There's no chief executive in this government. So you're like, how do they get anything done, right? I mean, like, who carries out the actions that the legislature proclaims? And I think it's worth, again, just reading a brief snippet here from in 1781. They realized this document's not working so well. We've got to try to create a new constitution. And in doing that, they sent out an address to the people explaining, like, here's where we were at, here's where we've been, here's the new document we're proposing. And in doing that, they explained a little bit about the thought process that went into this 1776 Constitution. And what they said in 1781 was, when the people of this state first thought proper to assume government for themselves, it was a time of difficulty and peril. That form which was the simplest and first presented itself to their view. In the perturbation of spirits that then prevailed, they adopted without that thorough discussion and calm deliberation which so important an object required. And it was not intended to be lasting. It was expressly declared by themselves to be temporary. And so a little bit about the preamble, and then we'll get into the sort of what the government looked like itself. So I'm just going to scroll through all of these. So one of the things that's remarkable about this document itself is it has a preamble that looks remarkably like the Declaration of Independence, that begins with a litany of grievances against the crown. The first being, and I'm quoting, British Parliament deprived of us of our national and constitutional rights and privileges. Then they go on to complain about, this isn't a quote, but they go on to complain about how the ministry has set up an army and a navy to enforce its acts, that the military power was exercised with a, quote, wanton and cruel abuse of power in destroying the lives and properties of colonists in many places with fire and sword, close quote. They complained about how British authorities took ships and cargo from honest, industrious, and law-abiding merchants. They cited how Governor Wentworth and the members of his executive council had fled the state, leaving the government in collapse, that there was no ability to legislate, that the courts were closed, so criminals couldn't be punished, and that exposed the lives and property of honest people to, quote, machinations and evil designs of wicked men. And so they end by saying, we're for it. You forced us. You forced our hand, and that's why we have to do this. And that it ends by saying that the colony never sought to throw off our dependence upon Great Britain and would rejoice if there were reconciliation approved by the Continental Congress. But as I've already said, Langdon and Bartlett knew full well that that language was just window dressing to appease the doubters. And I'm going to talk, there were doubters, including here in New Hampshire, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So onto the structure of the government, and this won't take me very long. So the government itself, as I said, was a House of Representatives, which was made up of the delegates of the 5th Continental Congress. They then created this council as a separate branch of the legislature. Had 12 members. All bills had to pass both houses of the legislature in order to become law. Public and military officers were appointed by the legislature jointly. Judges had the power to. So one thing I don't talk a lot about here, but there's no mention except here of courts or judges or a separate judiciary whatsoever in this document. They recognize that judges are going to exist and they ultimately end up appointing judges, but they make no provision in the Constitution for what it looks like. But they do provide that judges will have the power to appoint clerks of court. They leave some powers with county voters, so the county treasurer and the recorder of deeds are to be elected by the voters of each county. Budget bills, like today, still have to originate in the House. Neither branch can adjourn for more than 10 days without the consent of the government, so you can't stop. So one house can't stop the other from acting. And then if there's a conflict, if this war goes on for more than a year, then we're going to elect a new legislature, and the council ultimately will be elected by the people as opposed to selected by the legislature the second time around. And then the vote happens by November 1, and the new legislature is returned by the 3rd Wednesday of November. So how does it work in practice without a governor or chief executive? Okay, so 2 different ways it works. So when the legislature is in session, what happened was the General Assembly, which was both houses acting together, they appoint a joint committee, usually with 2 members, one from the House, one from the council, to oversee work. And I'll just give you a couple examples here. One is from June 25th, 1776. So the task that the legislature had before it was it needed saltpeter, and saltpeter was important for gunpowder manufacturing, and they needed to gather up some saltpeter. So they appointed a joint committee to consult upon the matter and manner of procuring casks of saltpeter and to make a report as soon as possible. So that same day, the committee met. They came up with a plan. Here's how many barrels we need. Here's the size of the barrels. And they reported back to the legislature that they needed 120 barrels to be procured, and each barrel had to be 16 gallons. And then the legislature appointed a new committee to go out and get those barrels and buy them on behalf of the state and procure them for the saltpeter. So that's how it worked in one example. Sometimes it didn't work so well. So the other thing they did that day was they resolved that they needed a bridge from the mainland to Newcastle. And so the legislature had previously created a committee to identify a location about where this bridge should be. And this day, on January 25th, they appointed a committee to design a process for how to build a bridge from the mainland to Newcastle. So you know how anything built by committee works? Yeah. So the committee writes a report, and that report needs to be read to the full legislature, and that happens. And then the legislature creates another committee to put the first committee's plan into action. And that day they voted to appoint Captain Worthen, together with a member of the council, the Senate, to be appointed as a committee to purchase materials suitable to build a bridge of 14 feet in width in the clear in the place mentioned in the report of the other committee, which had been sent to view the best place for building a bridge from the mainland to Newcastle, in a substantial manner according to their best skill and judgment, and with the expedition that may be, and also to oversee that work while building the bridge, and that they may employ good carpenters on the work, and as many troops as shall receive 1 gill of rum each day whilst the work, besides their wages and rations as soldiers. How many people want to vote about whether that bridge ever got built? It didn't. So So, yeah, you know, I mean, it worked. I mean, for 8 years of the revolution, this is how they operated. But increasingly, when the legislature went into recess, because the delegates had farms to attend to, they were soldiers, they were fighting in the revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And so what they did is they appointed a committee of safety. And the committee of safety was a committee made up of members from both houses, often between 9 and 15 people. Meshach Ware was elected throughout the war as the head of that committee every single time it operated. And it didn't really have any defined powers. It was essentially had a mandate from the legislature to act in whatever way was necessary to keep government running when the legislature wasn't in business. And so that's how you work without a governor, or you don't. Okay. Sorry about my clicker here. Okay, here we go. So now, back to the path to independence, because I think this is an important piece, because even the opponents of the 1776 Constitution knew that by adopting this document, they were on the path to independence. This was not just a temporary measure. The opposition, there were a third of the representatives in the 5th Provincial Congress voted against adopting a constitution because of this. And many of those delegates came from Portsmouth, right here in Portsmouth. Portsmouth delegates filed a motion to reconsider, and they raised 9 points, and a few of which I think are worth mentioning, for why this was a bad idea. The third point was because colonies of New York and Virginia, which are in similar circumstances to us and much larger and more opulent, and we presume much wiser, I doubt it, to whom we would pay all due deference, have not attempted anything of the kind, nor, as we can learn, ever desired it. The fifth complaint was because it appears assuming for so small and inconsiderable a colony to take the lead in a matter of so great importance. Ouch. And Portsmouth, what are you guys thinking? Number 9, and this is, I think, the most important, they said because it appears to us in their motion to reconsider too much like setting up independency from the mother country. And Portsmouth held a town meeting. They sent a circular to 11 other towns who likewise came to the same resolution, and they all had similar views that this was dangerous territory. We were declaring our independence. On January 9th, so just 4 days after the Constitution was adopted, the only newspaper in the state, the New Hampshire Gazette, published a front page open letter that was from an individual named Junius, and that letter declared that it outlined all the reasons why this was a bad idea to declare independence from Great Britain. And it's interesting because the editor of that newspaper, Daniel I think it's either Foley or Fowle, was summoned to appear before the House of Representatives and give an account of the author of that piece. So tell us who wrote that letter. And further, to answer for his printing said piece, so much derogatory to the honor of this assembly, as well as the Honorable Continental Congress, and injurious to the cause of liberty now contending for. Later in the spring of that year, the Gazette published a number of editorials defending loyalists and their refusal to sign loyalty oaths, I should say. An interesting aside, for those of you who don't know anything about Daniel Foley, he's an interesting character. He actually is a refugee from Massachusetts. He had a newspaper down there where he had printed an article that, back in 1750s that was very critical of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, called The Monster of Monsters. And it criticized their adoption of an excise tax on rum that had been enacted by the legislature. He was, in fact, arrested by the legislature in Massachusetts for printing that pamphlet. He was imprisoned. He ultimately fled to New Hampshire and set up shop here with his newspaper. So he didn't seem to have learned very well. But he continued to run the paper after that for quite a while, and then ultimately gave it over to another relative. So that's sort of where we were at with the view of this as a move towards independence. So the Constitution of 1776 is an important document because, as I said, it remained in effect for the entire 8.5 years during the war. And there were a lot of complaints about that document. The lack of, as I talked about, the lack of an executive officer. There was a lot of complaints about how a few people held every single office in the entire branch, in every branch of government, often at the same time. Some of the most important complaints about the document, though, came from the New Hampshire grants, so up in the Upper River Valley region today. And they protested that the problem with this 1776 Constitution was it was adopted by the very legislature that it then became. The legislature created its own power. And they complained that it wasn't a true constitution that was enacted by the people. And that was one of the most important criticisms of this document. And Meshach Ware and the other leaders of the government recognized that that was a flaw. And this is something that, very disappointingly, on the National Constitution Center, we don't get credit for. But they actually set up here in New Hampshire the first true Constitutional Convention in 1778 to draft a new constitution to replace the 1776 one. Massachusetts gets credit for it. It did it in 1779, but based on what was happening in the Upper River Valley, the New Hampshire grants, this criticism led to our actually setting up the first constitutional convention. And that, it took several tries. So the first convention meets in 1778. They propose a constitution that doesn't look very much different from the 1776. It still doesn't have a chief executive. There's still no governor in it because there's still a lot of hostility to this idea of having someone in a king-like position, in the royal governor position, and they don't want to adopt that. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. There were 3 more attempts between 1781 and 1783. They made some modifications. By 1780, Massachusetts had adopted a permanent constitution, the constitution that they still operate under today, actually the oldest constitution in the world, second only to New Hampshire. We're second only to them. And it was drafted by John Adams. And the New Hampshire recognized the wisdom of that model. It looked a lot different than what we had in the 1776 or even the 1778 version, because it had a true separation of power. It had 3 branches of government. It had structure to it. It had a Bill of Rights and all of those things. And so some of the back and forth, they had to sort of smooth over the tensions with the Upper River Valley folks. And until they could get them on board and vote for it, it eventually adopted a constitution that we have today, that are copies of which are up here, that went into effect on June 2nd, 1784. As I said, it was modeled on the Massachusetts Constitution and is second oldest in the United States and, in fact, the world. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what the legacy of all of this means. So New Hampshire, as I said, that was the formal step for independence and self-government. And I think that the Constitution, that experience between 1776 and 1784, has a direct impact on the government that we have today. The system of checks and separation of powers and checks and balances arose, as I said, directly from the flaws of that 1776 Constitution. And I think it's important to emphasize that it isn't this system we have today with 3 branches of government and the checks and balances that we all learn about in school. That was not a foregone conclusion in 1776 or 1780 or 1784. A system much like the 1776 Constitution existed in several other states, most prominently Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was even worse, I guess, if you want to call it that. They had a single legislature, 1 branch, no 2 branches of the legislature. And the way laws worked in Pennsylvania was the legislature passed a law. That law didn't go into effect until the next election, when the next legislature had to pass the law again. So the voters, under the theory of the Pennsylvania Constitution, acted as a check on the legislature. So if they didn't like the law that the legislature passed in session 1, they vote in new delegates, and those delegates don't pass the law in session 2. And so that was a serious competing model at the time. And so, but we ultimately went with this, and I think it was because of the recognition that this system that we were operating under with no separation of powers doesn't work quite as effectively. The other thing that I mentioned is I do think this idea of our 424-member legislature is very much a legacy of the debates of that period of time. A lot of the discussion focused on how many representatives there should be, who should be in the House, how big the House should be, and ultimately what the prevailing view was as wide of a representation as possible because of sort of that debate that took place during that time. A couple other things that we still have today that are in the document. Every 10 years, we have an opportunity to call a constitutional convention. We just had that vote in 2022, was the last time voters were asked whether we want a new constitutional convention. It didn't pass by a large majority. But in 1966, the voters at a constitutional convention changed the way in which we can amend the Constitution. So they allowed the legislature to propose amendments. So up until 1966, all amendments to the New Hampshire Constitution had to occur in a constitutional convention. But in 66, they allowed the legislature to propose amendments. And the way that works is each house, the full membership of the House, not a quorum, but the full membership, 2/3 of both the House and the Senate have to approve a constitutional amendment. And then, 60% of the House and 60% of the Senate, full membership, have to approve. It then goes to the voters, and the voters, 66.6%, 2/3 of the voters, have to approve the amendment before it changes the Constitution. And in 2018 is the most recent amendments we've had to the Constitution. So 80% of voters adopted 2 amendments. One was to protect informational privacy, so the government can't intrude on certain informational privacy. And number 2, there was an amendment to give taxpayers standing to challenge certain taxing and spending decisions of the government. In 2014, which was the last proposed amendment, which was an amendment near and dear to my heart that lost by only a couple hundred votes, which was to raise the age of judges' retirement from 70 to 75. And the reason, in part it voted, is because my wife and I canceled each other out. She wants me to retire. I love my job. and it got 65.6% of the voters. And it was just a few hundred votes short of becoming an amendment. And so that's the legacy of this document and a little bit about the history of this period of time. And I'm happy to answer any questions the best I can. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the Executive Council and how that's described in the
good.
Constitution and where that came from.
Sure. So I'm sure most people know this, but the Executive Council is the 5 elected representatives who work with the governor, who have to approve all appointments And so the governor makes, as with my position, I was nominated by Governor Lynch. I went before the executive council. The council then questions me and votes on whether I should be a judge or not, and a majority of the council gets the final say. They also approve all spending bills. So that was a back and forth. So it's a remnant of the royal council. Governor Wentworth and his predecessor Benning had a royal, and most governors had royal councils. They were not, for the most part, elected. They were appointed, although that vacillated. Sometimes they were elected, sometimes they were appointed, and there were changes, and there was push and pull under the royal government. The original, I hope I get this right, but my memory is under the Constitution of 1784, there was no council. They had a constitutional convention again 7 years later in 1792, and they revamped the government quite extensively, at least the operations. The original head of state was not called governor. He, at the time, was Meshach Ware, got elected as our first governor, who was called the president of the state. And then in 1792, they renamed that position governor. They created the executive council as a check on executive authority. And again, I think that's a remnant of this period of time, of the distrust of executive authority. I think that's direct.
You mentioned the Council of Letters. I was wondering how long correspondence took between the states who maintained the postal routes.
Oh, good.
And during the War for Independence, how did the postal authority work, and how was it effectuated?
Good question. So I don't know about the length of time. I'm not a specialist on that. But one of the very first acts that the legislature took, and this was actually under the Provincial Congress, upon the collapse of royal government, was to set up a post system. And they had post riders, people like Paul Revere, who would take that correspondence from town to town, because each town had, not each town, many towns had both a committee of correspondence, which was designed to communicate and coordinate efforts with other towns, and also a committee of safety that was designed to sort of, get the Minutemen together, make sure they had supplies, make sure that the people they were sending out, make sure government worked. So many towns had that. So post riders would communicate between towns, but they would also then communicate between the colonies too. And there was regular correspondence, as you can imagine, between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, because we had a lot of soldiers in the field very quickly under the siege of Boston. And John Sullivan, who I've talked about a few times, he was one of the generals outside, commanding the New Hampshire troops and militia outside of Boston. And he had quite a bit of back and forth. In fact, he wrote a very long letter, which I had in the PowerPoint, but it was too detailed, in which he gave a lot of thoughts about what this initial government should look like and whether we should have a governor. And he was like, yeah, don't do that quite yet. We're not ready for that. But he had a lot of back and forth and a lot of correspondence, not just about military matters, but about politics during that time too. But post riders was primarily how it happened. I covered it all. Thank you. Don't forget to grab your copy of the Constitution and please read it.